Welcome to another episode of the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak for today's episode from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Emily Rosado-Solomon, Assistant Professor of Management at Babson College, as our distinguished guest for today's episode. Dr. Emily's research encompasses two complementary areas of scholarly focus. Her primary research examines mental health challenges in the workplace, with particular attention to the experiences and integration of individuals with mental illness in organizational settings. Her secondary research stream explores interpersonal dynamics at work, investigating how employee interests and relationships shape individual work experiences and organizational culture. Her work has appeared in leading peer-reviewed journals, including the Academy of Management Review, Academy of Management Journal, and the Academy of Management Annals, and has been presented at conferences both nationally and internationally. At Babson College, Dr. Emily teaches primarily within the Foundations of Management and Entrepreneurship program, where she instructs undergraduate students in management and organizational behavior as they develop and launch their own business ventures. Throughout her academic career, she has taught a range of courses, including diversity management, human resource management, and related topics at both the graduate and undergraduate levels. Dr. Emily earned her PhD in Industrial Relations and Human Resource Management from Rutgers University and previously served on the faculty at California State University, Long Beach. Before transitioning to academia, Dr. Rosado-Solomon pursued a distinguished career as a professional pastry chef. She is a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park and gained extensive experience working in high-end restaurants, bakeries, and luxury hotels, setting a background that brings distinctive perspective and real-world insights to her teaching and research. Today, Dr. Emily Rosado-Solomon joins us to discuss her groundbreaking research, Others Matter When Mothers Return, an investigation of relational movement and its role in post-maternity leave reentry transitions. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Emily to the podcast. Dr. Emily, we deeply appreciate the gracious acceptance of our invitation. It's an honor and privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this work.
Professor, in your paper, you introduce the concept of relational movement, the idea that our relationship at work don't stay static when we return from leave. Can you explain what this movement look like and why it's such a critical yet often overlooked part of the re-entry experience?
Yes, definitely. So, this concept of relational movement that my colleagues and I found in this setting is really meant to describe this broad phenomenon where when mothers return to work after their leave from having a baby, what we see is their whole relational ecosystem shifts a little bit. And what that often looks like is some relationships might get closer with colleagues that they weren't previously as close with. Some relationships that they had that were previously close may weaken a bit. And then there may be new relationships that enter that they didn't have before with their coworkers, and some relationships that they did have that fall off the map that are no longer connected. And so it's important because really relationships at work more fundamentally just shape our work experience. That is sort of how we make sense of our work, what brings a lot of satisfaction, and what brings a lot of productivity to the work. And so when our relationships shift, it really plays an outsized role in fundamentally shifting our work experience.
Professor, a lot of previous research focuses on the internal psychological changes a mother goes through her identity or confidence. Why was it important for your team to shift the lens towards and look at the space between people, the relational dynamics that happen between a returning mother and her colleagues?
I think that's a great question. So I think it's important to note when we started this project, we were really broadly interested in mothers' experiences returning to the workplace after maternity leave. And the type of research we did is what we call inductive research. So this is research where we went in with broad questions and then we saw what themes emerged from the participants' own lived experience. And the importance of relationships was actually something that we saw women continuing to report on. So it's not like we knew going in that relationships were the big thing. This is something that emerged during the research process. And I think you're totally right. These changes to identity and confidence that women in particular have at this critical time in their lives and in their working lives is really important. But what's also important is that a lot of these changes actually happen in relationships. So if you think about an evolving identity, women following maternity leave, particularly when it's after their first child, are changing their identity, as you've noted. And what they're doing is almost like trying on a new identity. And that process is strengthened if a coworker responds to that positively, and if it's part of an improved connection between the woman and her coworkers. If people respond to that negatively, that identity change process can actually be hampered. So while we think about identity at first as an individual process, understanding these relationships that women are in as their identity and their confidence is changing really helps us see the broader picture of the forces that are at play here.
Dr. Emily, you found that some mothers experience relational enrichment where their connection actually deepen after having a baby. One fascinating mechanism you mentioned is infusing family into work, like a bioethics professor using prenatal screening as a teaching example. How does bringing that wool chef to work actually strengthen professional bonds rather than weaken them?
Sure. So I think that this is a really good question because it's part of really a broader issue of authenticity at work. And that is that research shows when we, within certain bounds, disclose a bit more about ourselves and our personal lives, people feel a stronger connection. And this isn't just in this context, this is in all contexts. And so I think that this is a really interesting example of a way that we might not expect enhanced authenticity to appear in the post-maternity leave context, but that we really did see an opportunity for authenticity. And when you feel like you know somebody and who they really are and not just their professional selves, then it's easier to form deep connections. And perhaps, as we see in our research, oftentimes there are more points of connection than just what we might have professionally in common. And so that was, I also thought, a really interesting example. And that was still an example that I use in my own professional life, where I talk about my son a great deal. My undergraduate students know quite a bit about my son and those experiences. And that does bring us closer because then they know when they have challenges in their own personal life, they're aware that I have a personal life. And I think that it lets them know that I may be more sympathetic, and that I am sort of a more well-rounded person than just a professor staring at them from the front of the room.
Professor, on the flip side, you discuss relational detachment. One driver of this was increased relational assertiveness, mothers becoming more direct or saying no more often to protect their time. How can women navigate this tension between being efficient parents and maintaining the chit chat that often fuels workplace camaraderie?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I do have other research projects in the area of small talk at work. So I think very much about the importance of small talk and chit chat in the workplace. So it is a fact that comes from our data that a lot of women just don't have the time to both spend as much time at work as they did prior to having the baby and also take care of their family commitments that have newly increased. And so we do find them being increasingly assertive, closing their office doors so that people don't walk by and chat with them, flat out telling people that they don't have time to attend things like happy hours or other social events, or that they'll have to stay for less time. And so I think that we do see people, certainly we saw in our data some trial and error there where women don't get it right the first time, as with many things in transition. But ultimately, I think that women can have increased relational assertiveness and still find time for that small talk. So things like a few minutes before sitting down for a meeting or after a meeting, or, maybe doing things together. So taking a walking meeting in between building. I'm on a college campus, so we walk between buildings fairly often, taking walking meetings or lunch meetings or finding time to make those points of social connection in a way that's also efficient.
Professor, your paper discusses identity asymmetry, where colleagues might wrongly assume a mother is less committed or capable. You give striking examples of colleagues questioning a mother's motivation. How damaging are these small, often well-intentioned assumptions to a mother's sense of belonging?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that they're very damaging. We see this over and over again in our data that small comments that even the participants, acknowledge probably were not intended to mean anything of consequence, that were, as you say, well intended. Oftentimes, that's what sticks out to women as an exemplar of their colleagues' reaction. So I'll give you probably the example that my colleagues and I keep going back to from this research is that women had such different reactions to colleagues asking how their baby is. So some women loved that, and some women, to your question, said, I don't want to talk about my baby. I want to talk about whatever the work topic at hand is. And I don't want them to see me as a mother first. I want them to continue seeing me as a professional before they see my maternal identity. And even though they knew that these questions were often really well intentioned and coming from a good place, they said it had a disproportionate impact on how they thought that their colleagues saw them, and in turn, more broadly, how they felt about their relationships with their colleagues, which was sometimes that they felt dismissed or undermined. And that asymmetry, that identity asymmetry, really did sort of impede their positive sense of self and connection in the workplace.
Professor, we often hear about self-efficacy, confidence in doing the job. But your research highlights self-compassion, being kinder to oneself as a key outcome of positive relational movement. How does having supportive colleagues actually help a returning mother become less of a perfectionist and more sustainable in her career?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And we saw a lot of this first just by sheer necessity, in that if returning mothers have more to do in a day than there are in hours in that day, something has to give. And so it is almost impossible to continue being a perfectionist and living up to those self-imposed standards. But a lot of the instances of relational enrichment that we saw actually did really help mothers with this self-compassion, which is they saw that other women who they viewed as professionally successful and aspirational, sort of peeking behind the scenes on that topic I talked about of improved authenticity in relationships, they saw that those other mothers weren't necessarily doing everything that they had set out to do. And they also had sort of similar frustrations with not being able to meet perfectionist tendencies. And so I think that seeing that in other people who are viewed as aspirational, in addition to the people that they had relational enrichment with, being more compassionate to them and saying, that's okay, you're doing things really well, and sort of shining a positive mirror on their experience, did help women to reach that self-compassionate outcome that was really ultimately very important for their well-being.
Professor, you choose to study academic mothers specifically. Academia is known for both flexibility and rigid ideal worker norms. What makes this specific industry such a powerful lens for understanding the struggles working mothers face across all sectors?
Yeah, so I think that academia is, as you point out, a really unique context, but it helps us address some of the deeper issues of what's going on here. So if it was a traditional organizational setting that had very rigid hours that people had to work, that had a rigid structure, we might ask more superficial questions that are still important, but we might wonder, oh, if only they had the flexibility, would that solve all the problems? Or if only they could work different hours or had fewer constraints, would that solve the problems? And in academia, those questions aren't necessarily here because we do have so much flexibility. And so by removing sort of some of the more obvious barriers, our team was really able to see some of the deeper barriers, which are these preconceived notions that our coworkers might have towards women who have just had babies, the interplay between a mother's evolving identity and her coworkers' reactions. All of those things we wouldn't be able to see in other contexts, I think, because of the more sort of obvious and salient barriers that we see within traditional organizational structures.
Professor, you have written about mothers forming a kind of secret club or finding unexpected allies at work, which reflects homophily, people naturally gravitating toward others they see as a similar to themselves. For a woman who is the only mother on her team, How can she intentionally build that sense of shared experience and support when it doesn't arise on its own?
I think that's an excellent question. And that is often the case where a woman will be the only person in her position, having just had a new baby in her team or in her local work context. I think one of the things that has been tremendously helpful in other research that I have personally experienced is that there are so many other areas now where women can get together who are working mothers who have these sort of unique challenges. So I'll give you another personal example. I've been part of a social media group since my son was born that is specifically for academic women who have babies that are all born in the same year. And so we are from all over the world, but we all share these unique characteristics of both being academics and mothers of children who are the same ages. And that has been so important. I was in graduate school when my son was born, and so there were no other graduate students at the same parental stage as me. But having other people who were only a couple clicks away on my computer or my phone did provide really similar sort of support and almost, access to that virtual secret club, even when it wasn't in the workplace. And that was, I think, just as effective as the workplace support that I now have in person from other people who have similar maternal status.
Professor, if a manager or a colleague is listening this episode and wants to support a team member returning from leave, what are the micro moves they can make? How can they show support without being intrusive or making assumptions about her capacity?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that was really powerful that came out of our research is this idea that women oftentimes know what works best for them and they know what they want. And just because it's idiosyncratic and different from other women, maybe in the same position, doesn't mean that it's unknowable. So, what I always recommend to managers or to coworkers is when a woman returns from maternity leave, or even before she returns or before she goes on leave, particularly for managers to ask how they can be supportive. Some women might want changes or ask for changes in scheduling or changes in work tasks. Other women might not. Other women might just want to dive back in because that is what fuels their, preferred identity expression, and because it is important for them to have that ability to dive back into work. And so literally just it is sometimes as simple as asking the woman either before she leaves or when she comes back. And then in terms of other micro moves, I always like to use hedging language. So I might say, hey, it's great to see you back, for instance, to a colleague who's just returned from leave. I can say something like, I'd love to hear about the baby, but I understand if now is not a time that's good for you to share. So if and when you're comfortable, I'd like to share, or I'd love to hear about it. And that allows my colleagues to either say, great, and let me show you some pictures if they want to discuss the baby, or it might allow them to say, great, let's get through this meeting or this project first, and then another time I'll talk about it. So it really does empower the woman herself to drive the conversation there. And so giving her an out or giving options, I think, is a really important micro move. And we can continue to do that. Or another thing that I do often that I think it speaks to our research is I'll often make I statements. So I'll say, I remember feeling stress or feeling uncertain when I returned to work after my son was born. If you ever want to talk about it, please let me know. And so that opens the overture so she knows that she's not alone, certainly if things feel uncertain or overwhelming. But at the same time, I'm not putting her on the spot. I'm not asking invasive questions that might make her feel that she has to talk about something more than she wants to. So I think that those are all sort of really low-hanging fruit in terms of relational micro moves that we can make to enact some of the principles that come out of this research project. But really, if you don't remember, to all the listeners, if you don't remember what else to do or what else to say, just ask the woman what would be helpful, or make a couple of suggestions, especially if you're a manager. You can say, I can reorganize this or I cannot, and which would you prefer, instead of making assumptions about what would be best for her.
Dr. Emily, I'd like to conclude this episode with one last question. Your research challenges the narrative that motherhood is a drain on a career. Instead, you show it can expand empathy and authenticity. If you could give one piece of advice to a mother dreading her return to work next week, How would you encourage her to approach her workplace relationships?
I've thought about this quite a lot, and I think back 8.5 years ago to what I would have said to myself or what I wish people said to me. And I remember one piece of advice that stood out from my doctoral advisor at the time when I was telling her all about my plans right before I left for maternity leave. And I was planning on being very productive as soon as I got back. I didn't quite grasp yet the challenges. It was before I had my child. I didn't quite grasp the challenges that being a working mother can entail. And she was wonderful. And I very vividly recall her saying, I hope that you have the balance that you are envisioning for yourself, and I will be very supportive of whatever plan you make in any way that I can be. She said, and she had two very young children at the time, and she said, and also, if the plans change and you find that things aren't working out exactly as you had envisioned them, that's okay too. And I will be with you and will be there to support you if you need to change the plans. And so I think thinking about how helpful that was in my own transition after maternity, or after my son was born, rather, and how I have seen other colleagues navigate this, and particularly in our data in this project, what I would say is find people who will support you and be okay if it doesn't go according to plan or the way you think it will. And it's okay if you don't have a plan at all at this point, and if it all just sort of seems overwhelming and impossible. And I think that looking for places in the workplace that are either a sense of community or validation about this experience or support or self-efficacy. There are likely things that a woman returning next week is probably really good at and really practiced at from her job that maybe is a helpful source of self-esteem when everything about having a new baby might not feel like everything is going well. And so I think looking for those sources of connection or validation or self-esteem, even if it's just 5 minutes, finding those resources and trying to build community in the workplace, because the workplace really can be, I think, make people better mothers. And being a mother can make people happier and better in the workplace. And that really is what our research shows, is that there's this positive synergy there. And so if it feels impossible, I would say it does get better and that there are these benefits.
Listeners, thank you for joining us for this insightful conversation with Dr. Emily Rosado-Solomon. Her research sheds important light on how relationship at work shape mothers' experiences when they return from maternity leave, and how small everyday interactions can either support or undermine their well-being and careers. As always, the aim of this podcast is to bring rigorous research into real-world practice, and today's discussion offered powerful ideas for managers, colleagues, and working parents alike to reflect on their own roles in making re-entry more human and sustainable. Thank you for listening. Thank you once again, Dr. Emily, for sharing such powerful insights from your research, and we look forward to engaging with you future work as well. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much for having me.